Don't you love technical difficulties, folks? We're gonna actually give it just another minute, but I wanted to jump in and make sure that things were actually showing the way that they were supposed to, and I think that they are. This is the last night that I am using the configuration that I have for this stream. Um, I will actually have two screens with me uh, on the next history stream that we have. So I'm just checking some of that stuff over right now. But hope everyone out there is doing well. We took off most of this week. It was a training seminar week. It was extremely painful. It was extremely painful. Should probably be careful about saying that, just in case anybody from that class shows up. Probably. Anyway, but welcome to another Forgotten History stream. We do these every month towards the end is what I'm trying to do. Sometimes it happens that way, sometimes it doesn't. December was not like that. December, we did it before Christmas. Of course, last stream, Bonnie Canuck was with us talking about Unit 731. We're going to change gears just a little bit. This month, we're going to jump back in time about 30 years to World War I. And then we're really going to throw everybody for a loop because the next topic that we'll be talking about after this will be the ATF program, and that will actually be a 3-part series that we'll be working on towards February, March, and April. And that'll take us into some other really exciting stuff as we move into the springtime and one whole year since COVID. So, but tonight we're going to be talking about the Zimmermann note, the Zimmermann telegram. It should. Oh, I know why. Thank you, Seven. That should fix it. Thank you for that. I've got mods that are looking out for me, pinging me. Like I said, it's great when you have a stream that has occasional technical difficulties, but it's also even better when you have mods that are looking out for you as well. So we're also implementing a couple of new things here. The biggest one of those things is that chat is operating in follower-only mode whenever we do one of these history streams, and that's more so for you guys than anything else. We want to make sure that when we're streaming more serious content like this, that we aren't getting bombarded with things that don't necessarily track, and those things happen quite a bit. So now I can't get back to my little screen thingy that I like, where I can actually monitor chat. Oh dear. There it is. Sorry. Anyway, yeah. Can you? I've done this before, but you wouldn't know it. So the presentation tonight is going to be a little bit more unorthodox, actually, than it normally is anyway. So I guess these goofy things aren't that big of a deal. This was one of my first attempts at creating a presentation that was a little bit more entertaining. So there's a bit of a background to the presentation that has a background on a war. So the background of the presentation is when I started working for the Army, this was the first presentation that I was tasked to build by my supervisor at the time. And then that presentation proceeded to get totally lost because it doesn't exist anymore because he kept it on his hard drive. And when he left, his hard drive got wiped. And we lost the presentation. So I had to make a new one. This is the new one. And I made it maybe a year and a half ago. So it's come full circle. But this is also one of the first times that Twitch is going to get a presentation before one of the public libraries in town does. So we'll see how it goes tonight. Anyway, it's important to kind of keep a few things in mind when we're talking about World War I and what eventually is going to bring the United States into the war. The biggest thing that people really want to go with is the Lusitania sinking in 1915. And that was a big part of it. I don't want to undersell that because it was absolutely a big part of it, but more so was the action that led to the sinking. So by about 1915, there was plenty of America, Europe, arms trading, arms dealing that was going on. And a lot of the times you would see American freight being shipped to the Allies under the guise of an American flag or a passenger ship. And so the Germans, in their infinite wisdom that the Germans had at the time, decided that they were going to start sinking everything. It was a policy that was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, this was pissing off the Americans, and you can understand why. Lusitania, of course, was an absolute catastrophe. Hundreds of Americans actually lost on that. It gets to the point to where 10 May of 1916, the Germans are going to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare. A few months earlier, we have the Battle of Verdun. A little bit later than that, we have the Brusilov offensive, so the Russians are pushing on the Eastern Front. But all of this kind of culminates and kind of brews and stews as conflict in the world wars tends to do. It just kind of stews and simmers, and then it grows into something much more, I don't want to say sinister, but it grows into something that kind of spirals out of control. And we're going to see that tonight when we take a look at things with the Zimmermann telegram. Now, this is the breakout of armies as they stood in August of 1914. So this is the shortly after war is declared. And the general breakout here is, you'll have the 1st through the 7th German armies that are going to be breaking out on the western flank of Germany and through Luxembourg, and they're going to basically use Schlieffen Plan, and they're going to curve their way out and around and try to capture Paris. They'll shell Paris. We talked about that during the Atomic Annie presentation, actually. They used a Paris gun, which was one of the predecessors to the predecessor to the predecessor of Atomic Annie. And this is just kind of the layout to give you guys an idea of the situation that we were dealing with on the Western Front. The Eastern Front doesn't look anything quite like this, of course, but oftentimes we see too much. So I'll tell you guys right now, we're using West Point primarily for our maps and generating maps and getting everything out. And there is very little that West Point is interested in on the Eastern Front, because by and large on the Eastern Front, the Americans aren't getting too much involved. So there's a big gap in American history that focuses on the Eastern Front at any given time. Eastern Front is also where there's a large mass of casualties because the Russians have a really great history of just like, well, we're just going to start throwing people at the problem, and whoever dies, dies, and whoever lives, lives. And the people who die, die for country, and they're heroes, and the people who live, live for country, and they're heroes. That's kind of the mentality there. And I don't want to sell it short, the mentality, and I'm very much oversimplifying the mentality, but that's generally what we see on the Eastern Front. So, what was the state of Europe in December of 1916, on the eve of when Zimmermann is going to be tasked to author this note that he is going to send? Well, the Eastern Front had been hammered in the Brusilov offensive, which we'll get to. The Allies were able to push the Germans away from Verdun, so there was a big shunt by the German army that comes in towards Verdun, and the Allies are able to repel them by the skin of their teeth. The Americans are funneling supplies to the Allies, as I mentioned, with the Lusitania incident. Italy has abandoned the Central Powers at this point. They have actually joined the Allies. American intervention has increased the Germans' kind of weariness about unrestricted submarine warfare. So they know that the Americans are getting really, really pissed off about the use of submarines and U-boats in the war and sinking American flagged ships, regardless if they are actually sending supplies to the Allies. They're just pissed off that they're losing people, personnel, materiel, and ships. They're sick of it. In general, too, around this time, the Western Front has turned into a defensive battle. So those front lines are not going to move all that much, as we're going to see here in just a minute. And the U.S. starts arming their ships that are being sent out. So they're telling the Germans, hey, you start attacking us, we're going to start attacking back. So if we see you, we're going to shoot you. That kind of thing. So we start seeing some of these signs early in about 1916 that the Americans are saying, hey, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect American assets. And so here is that breakout that I was telling you about. So these are the lines as they stood with a couple of key points in January of 1917. So this is kind of what the breakout looked like. So the Eastern Front there, the Brusilov offensive, we'll talk about that, but Brusilov basically is going to try and push out of the Brusilov offensive. And actually, in reviewing some of this, I'm wondering, I think that, well, no, that's about the right spot for the Brusilov offensive. Verdun, like I said, they're going to actually repel German advances at Verdun, and they're going to close this bulge here that they have on the Western Front by July of 1917 as well. So this is after the Americans have gotten involved, but they're going to close this by 1917 just a little bit. And then there's also going to be a southern front that's going to open, and Italy is going to get involved by the beginning of January 1917, and then Greece, the front at Greece, is going to open later in July of 1917. So part of what we have to look at for this comes from Japan, actually, because, all roads apparently lead to Japan, except there's no roads that go to Japan, so insert your own joke here. So early on in the war, Japan is under obligation to the Allies that they're basically to, if Germany acts up, all right, this goes back into that whole thing of I have treaties, I have treaties, I have treaties, I have treaties, I have treaties. Treaties with my enemies, with my friends. They have treaties with my enemies and my friends, and so World War One is just a giant ball of treaties, as we all come to know. Well, Japan is obligated under one of these treaties, specifically with the UK, to, well, it's Britain, not UK yet, to basically seize assets in the Pacific theater that are associated with Germany if Germany attacks Britain. And so Japan does that very well, I might add. And they're very quick to mop things up in the Pacific theater. And in fact, they're so quick to mop it up that they're ready to turn right around in about 1916, late 1917, actually, and make their way up the peninsula from Korea into the Soviet Union, which it's the Soviet Union by that point, and start operations in Siberia in the Siberian campaign, right? So to withdraw white Russian forces out of the Soviet Union, provide safe haven for them, which they're not really doing, but we're going to say that that's what they were doing for the sake of keeping the presentation on track. And so they'll actually be somewhat quasi cooperating with AEF Siberia through 1919. But when the Americans and the British leave in 1919, the Japanese are going to stay there through 1925. So we start to see these early signs that Imperial Japan might be wanting to underline the imperial part here. So they're going to seize all of the German assets in the Pacific theater And the assets that they seize, that we'll see on the next page, I want you to take a look at the map that I have here on the lower left-hand portion of your screen. That is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere as it stood in 1941. Now, when you take a look at the assets that the Japanese will seize here in 1914, it's going to be actually a pretty decent amount of this that's already been seized, and you can kind of see where the Japanese are staging a step-off point. So that's why a lot of us in the military history community generally say that World War II is actually just a continuation of World War I. It's unchecked parameters that we have in the Pacific Theater that ultimately leads Japan into this path that it's going to be on. But I digress. The big thing here is that Germany has lost all of its assets in the Pacific Theater, and Japan is in no uncertain terms interested in giving any of them back to Germany at this point. And to give you an idea here, so this is the IJA line in the North Pacific Ocean here that you see. There's actually two of them. One of them situated basically across the East China Sea, and expands out into the North Central Pacific Ocean, past the volcano islands here, past the Marianas. And they're actually going to push the Germans all the way down into Papua New Guinea and then mop them up across the Bismarck Sea, the Philippine Sea, and across southern portions of the North Pacific Theater. They're also going to go into Qingdao. They're going to clean up German forces there, and then they're actually going to push north, like I said, in that Siberian expedition. And they're going to link up with several American units that are operating by late 1917 up in the Russian theater to extract white Russian, what's the word I'm looking for? Sympathists, I guess is what I'm looking for, because most of the white Russian movement is situated on the Western Front, the Western Soviet Front, let me say, mainly because they're operating in locations that are associated with Poland and Czechoslovakia and places like that. So, one of the other key points at this time is the Brusilov offensive. And the Brusilov offensive is, again, it's one of those things that we just don't hear about in American history all that much. So General Alexei Brusilov here, great mind. He came up with an idea to try and, because at the time the Allies are just screaming to have the Russians bleed off some of the German and Axis, or it's not Axis at this time, it's Central Powers, but bleed off some of the Central Power force that is encroaching on Verdun. So Alexei Brusilov is actually going to come up with an idea to stage an all-across-the-line offensive in the southwest or southeast corridor of the Eastern Line, and he's going to use that to try and push into the German line, attacking all up and down it to try to alleviate that pressure. So, in addition to this, it was also seen as a good idea because at the time, Russia had its influence over Prussia and parts of Galicia, or I guess we're going to call it Gallica, or Gallic. I'm American. What do you want from me? But they're going to try and push into this to recover assets that had been lost when the Central Powers had actually broken out. There's a lot of historians that'll actually cite this as one of the greatest feat of arms for the Russians during World War I, and indeed it is. There's over 2 million soldiers associated on both sides of this, and it is just, it's mostly, it really is. It's a cavalry charge that just pushes as hard as it can across the line. Now, there's another individual within the Russian High Command named Evert. And Evert had his eyes set high on promotion. And one of the problems is that when the Russian High Command approved of Brusilov's campaign over what it was that Evert had presented, Evert basically just decided to sit on his hands as much as he possibly could. So it was actually in Brusilov's plan. Evert was supposed to actually lead the primary campaign and charge across the bulge here that you see on the lower left of your screen. And he was supposed to actually push in on this and make his way all the way over toward. I'm looking at the map here. He's supposed to make his way over towards Warsaw, is what he's supposed to do. And when the time to charge comes, Evert sits on his hands, leaving Brusilov to have to be the one that's pushing so far out. And actually, he pushes so far out that he loses contact with Evert's group, and basically they have to fall back to a certain degree so that they don't get outflanked by the Central Powers. The end result of this is that there's about 1 million or so Russian casualties. It totally broke the Austrians. It was extremely successful in bleeding off the Austrian army because after this, the Austrians had nothing left to provide to the Central Powers. The problem was, though, is that it wasn't the Austrians that were causing problems on the Western Front. It was the Germans, and the Germans lost about 350,000, which, while it did succeed in alleviating some pressure, it didn't alleviate enough for there to be no campaign on Verdun at all. So what I've got here is we've got the before and afters. So you'll see the 3 different stages here. So 4 June, that's the initial line there. By 10 June, they've created a bulge here near Lutsk, and they also have pushed out here on the southern portion. By what is this? Mid-July, they've pushed out beyond Lutsk. They're approaching on Brody. Then by 20 September, the campaign has actually completed. They have succeeded in taking Lutsk. They've also succeeded in a couple of other objectives. I'm not going to try and pronounce these because my Russian is terrible, guys. But they've successfully taken 2 other objectives on here, falling well short. And you can see Eworth is actually taken out of the equation altogether, falling well short of Brest here. They fall well short of that. Koel, they also fall well short of Warsaw. So while as far as gains go, the Brusilov offensive was not that successful as far as it breaking manpower in the Central Powers and as far as alleviating some pressure from the Western Front, it was successful. And it's worth noting, too, Brusilov does go on to serve in the Red Army, so he will become a Soviet Army commander for a short period of time before retirement, and then he goes into retirement. And if memory serves me right, he remains a sympathizer to the Soviet Union. Now, again, on the other side of this, we have the Battle of Verdun. And so the Germans are interested in breaking through Verdun because it's a major transportation center, right? So, and in addition to that, the Douaumont is one of the main forts that is housing a lot of French forces. The German offensive launches with just a ridiculously heavy bombardment and basically just craters the battlefield. But the problem is that the Germans are going to rush in, they're going to encroach upon Verdun, and then they're eventually going to realize that, hey, we can't get supplies in this terrain. We also can't get supplies on the roads because they're just beaten to hell, and there's just no way that we can actually do this with the current logistic support that we have. And that's a lot of things that we see with the Germans is that eventually they run out of logistical support. Same thing is true when the Germans are actually rushing into the Soviet Union, is that they're running out of logistical support in the meantime. So it's one of these recurring themes, but one of them begins here in Verdun. So the city of Fleury had changed hands over a dozen times by August of 1916. So you figure between 21 February of 1916 and I think it was by about 9 August 916. So you're looking at what, 6 months? So you're changing hands. You're German. No, you're French. No, you're German. No, you're French. Well, that happens once a month. So that's kind of insane when you think about it. But Fleury was the focal point of where you see most of the action. They generally stave things off from Verdun proper. By about 5 November, any gains that the Germans had made were completely nullified. The French had effectively driven the Germans back. However, the battle was extremely costly. There's 1 million casualties between the French and the German forces, with a mortality rate of equal to or greater than 25%. Now, Douaumont, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the main forts that is situated near Verdun, and you can see before and after pictures down here. So the left photo is just prior to when the Germans launched the attack at Verdun in February, and then the right actually shows what it looked like in March. And I tried to align this as close as I could, but it is bombed and tattered to hell, to give you an idea here. So the Germans are going to occupy Douaumont up through late September, early October, and then it was actually repaired in time for operations, and eventually we'll see staging points there for both French and American forces as we move into 1917. And then here's that breakout again for the Battle of Verdun. So we have Verdun situated just off center in the map here, but as you can see here, Fleury is actually just about dead center, and that's where you were going to see these constant ebbs and flows in gains and losses between the Germans and the French. The Germans are not going to quite make it all the way to the Meuse River at this stage. They will get close in some of these locations, but they won't quite make it to the Meuse River, at least at Verdun. They'll come up awfully close to it. Fort San Michael here. You'll see them actually pushing in a little bit, like I said, there near Fleury, up here towards Samono, but you won't see them making it quite all the way to Verdun. But Verdun does get shelled heavily during the battle, simply because it's well within the range of artillery fire. Now, we're going to leave Europe for a moment. This actually is a presentation about the United States, guys. So we're going to leave Europe for a moment. We're going to go check out things in North America, because things are not all that okay in North America either. So around the same time as the battle in Verdun is going on, the Americans have deployed an expeditionary force into Mexico. Why to Mexico? Well, there is an individual by the name of Pancho Villa, and he has been launching attacks on small border towns on the U.S.-Mexican border. And the big thing there is that at the time, there is a civil war that is happening in Mexico between sympathizers of Pancho Villa and sympathizers of Carranza, who actually is recognized, I should say, by the American government as um, the rightful executive authority in Mexico. So, because of this, Villa will launch attacks over the Mexican-American border, primarily in New Mexico and far western portions of Texas. The punitive expedition had just been wreaking havoc on U.S.-Mexican relations, though. It wasn't necessarily that Carranza himself was irritated by American presence, although he was. I don't want to sell that short. But the Mexican population was largely not impressed. These are American personnel that are coming in and basically running all over the place, and there's really nothing that anybody can do about it, because technically the Americans being there is in of itself massive international incident. And the big thing that Carranza has a problem with is Carranza wants to just deal with it. He doesn't want the Americans to be involved. So the Americans are going to come in. They are going to um, they are going to dwindle Villa's forces, but by and large, the punitive expedition is not great. It's not working out all that great for the Americans, and eventually, indeed, the Americans are going to be recalled. But the key thing to remember here is that the tensions between Carranza and the American government are just abysmal at this point. So you have, the 10th Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers. This is where they come out of. You'll see plenty of National Guardsmen that are situated on the border. 6th and 16th Infantry there, as mentioned. But they are being recalled, and this is one of the key things to point out about the note. They are being recalled as early as 2 January. Forces are being recalled by the president. Rather, they're being called by Blackjack Pershing, who we'll see a little bit of here soon. They're being recalled because the Americans are aware something isn't quite right with what's going on in Europe. They're not wanting to get involved yet, but it would be wrong to say that the Americans did not see the writing on the wall at this time. Much similar to how the Americans saw the writing on the wall during World War II. So there is a recall, and as you'll see, the recall happens before the Americans are even aware that unrestricted submarine warfare is back and going to be brought back in play. So this is just to give you an idea, because so rarely do we see something quite this modern, where you see a map of American operations in the North American theater. So the attacks get launched into Columbus, New Mexico. It is basically just about due west of El Paso, a little bit southwest of Roswell. That's in March of 1916. You'll see all these blue lines here. Well, these are basically U.S. troop concentrations. So this is your National Guard situated on the border lines here. There's some that are over here towards Tijuana, San Diego, Mexicali. Then there's the rest of them are going to be focused primarily southern Arizona, all the New Mexican border with Mexico, and parts of West Texas, and then filtering down towards Laredo and McAllen. Now, there's going to be 2 points where the Americans are going to step off from. They're going to step off from El Paso, and they're going to step off from Cloverdale. They're going to launch into basically the Mexican state of Chihuahua. At one point, they'll actually occupy the city of Chihuahua. And as I'm seeing here, Bonnie is actually pointing out in chat, occupation of Veracruz. So there's also, at the same time, Mexican federales that are making their way up from Mexico City, the Federale de Carranza, which are going to intercept at this point, and eventually they're going to be the ones that are going to be taking over operations in Chihuahua. Thankfully, because the Americans are about to get a very rude wake-up call. So unrestricted submarine warfare. This is that last piece of the puzzle. The Germans, like I said, they had employed indiscriminate attacks on naval vessels. Lusitania was sunk in 1915. 128 American passengers died. Arguably, along with God only knows how many arms that were possibly on that ship. At the time, the only thing that the U.S. was interested in doing was condemning the deployment of U-boats against American-flagged vessels. But the Germans had suspended this by May of 1916, but they understood a few things about the war. The Americans were transporting weapons. They were fully aware this is where these weapons have to be coming from. So the Americans are transporting weapons to the Allies on flagged ships. The Americans would likely be pushed to war if the Germans outright intervened again. So if we resume unrestricted submarine warfare, pretty sure the Americans are going to get involved. So they wanted to explore options to keep America distracted or out of the war long enough that they could finish up operations in the European theater to where the Americans might not be interested in going to war with Germany at all. So they come up with an idea to make sure that they can actually resume their U-boat war in 1917, or at least they think they've come up with an idea. So the extent of operations here. So by 1917, most of the shipping that is sunk is done so in relatively European waters. So you can see the main shipping lanes. So there's a western shipping lane, a southern shipping lane, and then the Mediterranean routes. And most of this the sinking of ships happens on the eastern portion of all these theaters, or entirely in the Mediterranean theater. But by the time we get into 1918 and the U.S. does end up declaring war, the Germans are operating off of American shores, waiting for shipping to come out. It's not quite near as bad as what we see during the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, but it's something worth noting. So, we have the European theater. We have, oh, we have been pushed back at Verdun. We have the Russians pushing in on the east. Italy has switched sides. It's a stalemate all across the front. Japan has seized all assets in the Pacific. The allegiance to the Allies seems to be faltering. The U.S. is providing war material to the Allies, launching forces into Mexico. Mexico is getting pissed off at U.S. involvement. And the U.S. is posturing to protect all shipping and is ready to go to war if they have to. Which begs one question. How do we solve a problem like Maria? And I'm realizing too that most of you who are on this platform are probably too young to understand who Maria is. Anyway, that's an old people joke. Let it go. But this is basically what the problem and the properties of Germany's problem is. This is what we're dealing with. How do we solve this problem? Well, we have a smart young guy in the German High Command, in the Wilhelmstrasse. What's his name? His name? Arthur Zimmermann. This song is a banger, though. Arthur Zimmermann here. He is the State Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And he is the one whose name is going to go on that telegram. Born 5 October 1864 in East Prussia. Unfortunately, he's one of my people. I don't claim him. He was decisive in his intent to work in the Foreign Service. In fact, a lot of the sources that I looked into that talked about Zimmermann suggested that he was just diehard. I want to work in government service of some kind. He's very insistent. He was very, very career driven. I want to work for the government. How can I do it? He had tried to kind of stave off the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia prior to 1914, so he's very much initially kind of a peacekeeper. But when World War I does kind of kick off, he changes. He's kind of seen as a warmonger at that point. And one of the things is that when he's the State Secretary of Foreign Affairs, he's relatively new to his job. He had just taken that position on 22 November. He's going to author that telegram in early January. He's going to send it in late January. And then he's going to get caught, kind of with his hands in his pants, if you will, as we'll see. Now, Heinrich von Eckart, he's the German ambassador to Mexico. Okay, so he's the recipient of the telegram. And he was born 22 July 1861. He was born in Russia. Now, he's still, which this is just an absolutely ridiculous idea this day and age, especially. He's still knowing that the Americans are tracking what's going on after the disclosure, he's still going to go to Carranza and say, hey, buddy, want to go to war? That doesn't go too well. And indeed, this blunder that they're about to find themselves in is going to cost them their whole career, their whole public image. They're both basically going to be in shambles when this is all said and done. But let's go down this road anyway, just in case. One other individual and a group of individuals that is very important that you definitely need to know of is this man right here. Reginald Blinker Hall, who is the spitting image of what I call a salty old sea captain. He's just missing a big bushy beard, and he'd have it made. He was born 28 June in Britford. He actually establishes the Royal Navy's decryption operation, which is called Room 40. You can see an artist depiction of the actual intelligence building down there at the lower left. He was actually kind of in a similar boat as Brusilov, so he was fighting for control and for recognition within the British High Command and the British Intelligence Committee. Eventually, he's going to win, but he expanded Room 40 staff basically. It starts with like 5 people, and he expands it to about 30 by 1915. Most of the staff that he pulls in are graduates from Oxford or Cambridge that are specializing explicitly in German language. Now, I have to point out that every source that I saw made a big deal about this. Why do they call him Blinker? Apparently, he blinked all the time, and if you ignored his blinking, that means that you lost whatever argument you were in. I shit you not. That is the complaint. That is the argument. Go look it up. It is true. Now, as for Room 40, Room 40 was top secret. Okay, it was a top secret operation, intercepted over 15,000 German communications during World War I. It ciphered patterns and relied on capture of code books. So, whenever any German assets were basically seized, um, they would actually have intelligence officers looking for code books that they could then send back to the cryptanalysis sect for use in Room 40. They focused on communication interception. MI6 focused on the arrest of spies, and MI5 was actually focused on espionage. So they were working in the same military intelligence group as some of these more well-known organizations. The communications had to be discreetly disclosed and usually kept in secret from the public, so they had to do this kind of roundabout thing, and we're going to see it with the telegram here in just a minute, where they have to use this roundabout way of disclosing the information that they have, because if they don't do it that way, they could potentially expose the entire operation. So, the German perception about potential allies. Who are Germany's potential allies? Well, we have Mexico here. It's an appreciable distraction, right? Considered dealing arms and munitions with Mexico. They knew what concessions the Mexican government was interested in possibly getting from the Americans. And the Kaiser actually suggested, and I dispute this maybe just a little bit, suggested that Zimmermann figure out a way to have the Mexicans, quote unquote, stir up trouble. Now, whether or not Kaiser Wilhelm actually said that, I don't know. I'm not going to pry at that one. I found that in a source. But somebody who was over Zimmermann may have actually said that. Whether or not it was the Kaiser, I don't know. Now, Japan's got some waning support for the Allies, okay? It's been idle since 1914. It took care of its duties to the Allies. It's done. So, Zimmermann had previously actually been associated with China. He had actually taken on a position as a diplomat to China, a German diplomat to China. So he built his propositions based on that experience. and sought also to capitalize on Mexican-Japanese weariness of the U.S. because at the time the Mexican government and the Japanese government were very, very vocal about their concern for how the Americans were um, operating within the Mexican theater and also in the Pacific theater at the time as well. They also understood that they needed to delay American shipments of materiel to the Allied powers. They needed those external war declarations to tie down those American forces, like I said, and possibly just even make it so that they had really they saw Mexico and Japan as pawns because they were just like, well, even if the Americans do defeat them, by the time they defeat them, we'll have things in Europe under control, so we can just turn around and throw our full force over at the Americans and take care of that. That was the mindset. So the telegram. So the Germans made the decision they could not win the war if America was providing war material because you have a totally untouched pool of resources that is constantly being funneled and thrown into the European theater. How do we take care of that? We resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So, what's a way to make sure that the Americans don't actually throw out a whole bunch of stuff and actually come after us? Well, we'll do a little bit of quid pro quo. If the United States gets involved, Mexico should declare war on the U.S. And if Mexico declares war on the U.S., we'll cede lost Mexican territory as compensation. So we're going to give you like Arizona, we'll give you New Mexico, we'll give you Texas, which at the time, a lot of older citizen population in Mexico is actually very interested, especially in the recovery of large portions of Texas. It also bolstered the need of cooperation with Japan and suggested that Mexico be the one to broker a deal between Japan and Germany. Something that is, it seems ridiculous at the time, and it kind of seems a little bit ridiculous in hindsight, but Japan is interested in what Japan is doing for Japan. And you really can make the same argument when you get out to World War II. They're interested in cooperating with Germany so long as Germany lets Japan do what Japan does. So it's really kind of an interesting idea. The telegram gets sent via the German embassy in the US. So this would be a spit in the face if this actually went through. And we'll see it on the next slide here. So they're actually going to send it through the US diplomatic channels through to Mexico from the US. So it first uses a code 0075 and then it switches to 1340. And if I'm remembering right, I believe 0075 is the old code and 13040 is the new code. The Americans could actually read I think 0075. I'd have to go back and look into my books about this, but there were two actual telegrams that were sent with this. There was 157, which was the note about unrestricted submarine warfare, and 158, which was the actual Zimmermann note itself. So these are the actual telegrams as they were deciphered. So the one on the left there, that is the original interception, and the one on the right is the notes, kind of the notes that were typed up, which aren't. There's even a few things that they've got crossed out here and there, but in general, what does it say? We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the President of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain. and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and, at the same time, mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. Signed, Zimmermann. Britain is so going to tell on Germany, because that is going to go through London on its way to America, unfortunately. So, as I said, transmitting, intercepting, and receiving, the telegram is sent through the U.S. State Department line. It has to pass through London to make the jump across the Atlantic, because the the British had actually severed German lines. The transmitted code, I was right, fantastic, was sent in 0075, which was the encrypted code. And then it was sent in 13040, which the Americans could not read, or which the Americans could read. But the Germans just said, hey, just trust us on this one. We're not sending anything weird through the line. And the U.S. ambassador transmits it. The second telegraph is sent on February 5, and it says, you should convince the president even now. Even though we don't know for sure what the Americans are going to do, you should just go ahead and tell him about it now. It's intercepted on the day of transmission. There's a partial decrypt by the end of the day. So the British are just working on this ridiculously fast. Hall opts to keep the telegraph a secret. He doesn't want the Americans to be involved with it right away, because he has to keep the operation relatively secret. So the full decrypt is what he wants to be able to present to the Americans. And here's the route here that it's going to take. It's going to jump from Berlin to Copenhagen on up to London, Porthcurno here over to Washington, D.C. before it finally makes its way to Mexico City. And boy, what a roundabout way to get there. That looks like a flight map to me, and that just looks god-awful if you ask me. But this is the way that they actually had to send the telegram, because, again, the Germans had no overseas lines. It wasn't that uncommon to see German communication pass through U.S. diplomatic channels. The Americans had been allowing this, and the British knew that, so they were tapping American lines. But they wanted to make sure that the Americans didn't know that that's what they were doing. So the British are eventually going to deliver the telegram, and the first disclosure actually takes one whole month before it actually makes its way out here. So Hall has to use restraint, because he can't let room 40 be exposed. Not only that, it'd be a huge international blunder that the British were tapping American lines. He also wants to see if the Americans are going to enter the war without any kind of intervention, because if the Americans are going to go ahead and enter the war, there's no reason for us to disclose this telegram anyway, and we can just totally save face on room 40. They also wanted to make sure that the British, like I said, were not privy, or the Americans weren't privy to the idea that the British were spying on their lines coming in, because that would just totally degrade relations between the two. They also had to wait for a second telegram to go through, because then it also covers them up from the German side, so that the Germans don't necessarily know for sure that the British are listening in on their lines. So here's kind of the timeline here. So 19 February, Edward Bell receives it. He believes it to be a hoax. Now, Bell is an American ambassador to Britain. Hall finally sends one to U.S. Ambassador Page. I guess Page is actually the ambassador. Bell is a secretary. The code text is provided to Page for verification on the 23rd. Page then relays that information to President Wilson. It's been over a month since the original interception, and Wilson just learns of it on the 23rd of February. And finally, 5 days later, Wilson releases the telegram to the press. And this is the first time the American public is being made aware that Germany has tried to bribe Mexico into attacking the United States. And I think this is a fantastic meme down here. Actually, both of these. So this is a prime example of old art meets new art. So we have a fantastic comic up here that appeared in 2 March 1917, and we have a fantastic meme down here that probably appeared in 2018. So 100 years difference. Yeah, figure that one out. Diplomatic ties with Germany are cut on the 3rd. The Americans are very hesitant about the authenticity at first, but eventually, when they see the original crypt, it's made to be a little bit more apparent that, hey, yeah, this is actually a big deal. There's a strong anti-European sentiment in the U.S. So the public isn't super duper outraged, but it kind of picks up, and you start to see an increase. The general increase was primarily against German Americans who were just getting the snot kicked out of them, and so that's kind of where the tipping point kind of happens. Now, Wilson had already implied that he was going to arm merchant ships. So when this comes across, he's like, "Well, we might have to go to war, guys." And then, unfortunately, as there is with any war that comes up, there's going to be anti-war elements. So the caveat was removed, though, when additional passenger and freight liners began to be sunk by the Germans, and by mid-March, public opinion had changed to demand action, pretty much, despite Wilson's anti-war presidential platform. Well, and yeah, Bonnie, I'm aware. It was amplified by the telegram, that anti-German sentiment. Uh, there were primarily focus on German Americans, and even still to a lesser degree Irish Americans, but the German American hate really flared um, after the telegram was received. There was also a pretty good bout on Italians in the United States around that time too. So it 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 inflamed that to a degree. Most most people most people the first couple of weeks in March in 1917 basically were just like, no, not interested. And then by the time you get to about 17 March, people were basically drag. What there's a couple of instances where there's Germans being dragged through the streets behind cars and shot and gored and maimed and all this other terrible stuff that nobody wants to think about anymore. So, an American declaration of war comes on 6 April 1917. Wilson, as we hear it referred to a lot, refers to it as a war to end all wars, and we're going to make the world safe for democracy. However, Wilson only mentions the telegram once in his address. Now, the Senate is going to pass 82 to 6 on the war declaration. The House is going to be 373 to 50. The appeal that Wilson will actually send comes a few days earlier, before he actually will make his final statement. Congressional approval brings the United States into the war at 13:11 hours on 6 April 1917. Now, what was Wilson's appeal? Wilson's appeal says, and I quote, "Whereas the Imperial German government has committed repeated acts of war against the people of the United States of America, therefore be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that a state of war between the United States and the Imperial German government, which has thus been thrust upon the United States, is hereby formally declared, and that the President be, and he is hereby, authorized and directed to employ the entire naval and military forces of the United States and the resources of the government to carry on war against the Imperial German government and to bring the conflict to a successful termination. All the resources of the country are hereby pledged by the Congress of the United States. That was the war declaration. Very, very, very pretty and scary words all at the same time there. So that's basically the story of America's entrance into the war. There's a couple of other things, though, that kind of grow out of this. So, Blackjack Pershing, as I mentioned, he was the one that was operating with the Expeditionary Force in Mexico at the time. He's going to be selected to lead the AEF in May. He arrives in France in June to begin preparations, but he has to implement a permanent restructure of American military policy that had not been in place ever. The first Americans are going to hit the trenches by autumn, and the American military force is going to go from 27,000 to over 2 million by the end of the war. But the problem is that Pershing has no authority that is equivalent to Foch and any of the other commanders that are operating in the European theater. So there has to be a breakout. We can no longer have an American expeditionary force. We have to have an actual set of armies. And for that, the AF dissolves and becomes what is known, and they're displayed over here on the right-hand side, First, Second, and Third Armies, all respectively, by the end of 1918. Now, as for the Germans, they're completely caught by surprise because the Germans had no idea any of this was going on kind of behind their back. Zimmermann opts to publicly accept and defend his authorship of the telegram. The Germans are actually going to turn on the Wilhelmstrasse. So the German public is just like, I don't even know why we listen to you guys. You don't even go here. It's really interesting to see some of the feedback that goes in from the German public. There's plenty of German newspapers in the U.S. in Germany criticizing the Kaiser and the Wilhelmstrasse about this whole fiasco. And neither Mexico nor Japan had expressed any interest in joining the German cause. And then you can see down there, Zimmermann admits plot against the U.S., seeks to justify intrigue as a measure of defense in the event of war, which, yeah, that sounds like a guy trying to cover his tracks, doesn't it? So what was the whole thing? What are the cliff notes kind of here? So this analysis was actually provided by a German magazine, and these are direct quotes. It was the responsibility of the Foreign Office in Berlin for ensuring the secrecy of the communication. Okay, so even if that's what we sent, we should have been better about keeping it secret. Number two, if the submarine war was going to bring Britain to its knees in weeks, why was a Mexican alliance even required? Number three, Carranza's control of Mexico was limited because Villa was still at large, reducing his value as an ally to the Germans. Number four, the Germans never even acknowledged Japan and never did establish a reason for them to switch sides. They never gave any kind of concessions. It was always kind of assumed that they were going to give Japan California and maybe Hawaii, but that was never actually stated. And number five was Mexico's weakened state from the war effectively made them useless to the German cause. Because even if they would have agreed to it, they had no forces to project anything. So let the Americans, if they are bent on war, deal with their strong domestic opposition. And had they actually done that, the Americans might have had a harder time actually bringing the public along to the cause, because if you recall, anti-war sentiment at the time was strong. And Thomas Bogart here, he wrote the Zimmermann Telegram. That's that book that's provided down there. Fantastic read. If anybody else is interested in the Zimmermann Note, I highly recommend that you that you look into that book. It's fantastic. But his analysis is thusly: the United States certainly would have entered World War I regardless of the telegram, but by removing Wilson's final doubts about the wisdom of joining the Allies, it accelerated U.S. intervention through perhaps only by a few weeks, which is also probably evident in the fact that when Wilson made his speech, the telegram was only mentioned once. Before we do jump to the end of the stream here, I'm just going to open it up, see if there's any comments. I'm going to scroll back through here. I want to make sure that I didn't forget all of you. Oh yeah, Kengar, sorry buddy. Yeah, it is. It's a more serious stream. I don't push to getting prohibition enacted as a constitutional amendment. Yes, yes. All that kind of ties in. So the anti-European sentiment ties into prohibition, which I'd love to see if somebody has a write-up on that, or has a presentation built somewhere, because that would actually be a fantastic subject to kind of debate, kind of see what people's thoughts and opinions were on it. Find the historiography interesting. Yeah, so possibly keeping America out of the war entirely would have taken a different president. I don't know. So one of the problems that you have to consider is the reaction by Wilson. And I've argued this before too with other people who have who have come up with theoretical history, which I like it when people come up with theoretical history. I think it keeps minds fresh. It helps us see things in a different light, in a different way. But I've mentioned this too, is that we'll use, for example, Hitler's response. Hitler's responses immediately. No, we're not even going to use Hitler. Let's use Bush. Yep, let's use something a little bit more recent. So Bush's response to the World Trade Center attacks. So when the World Trade Centers get attacked, the public wants a response. They may not necessarily know that they want it now, but they want a response, especially the people who are involved in that. So thousands dead, families broken, just an absolute mess and a disaster. Now, you as a leader are made aware of the culprit behind that. You have to come to terms with the fact that either A, you're going to do the right thing. And the right thing is going to be when you can walk and look those people directly in the eyes and you can say, this is the only option. And the only option is what? We're going to go and we're going to kick ISIS, or it wasn't ISIS at the time. We're going to go and we're going to kick Al-Qaeda's ass. Same thing for Pearl Harbor attacks, right? You are aware of the instigator. So while I think this was actually in this presentation originally, but it might have been taken out. So there isn't a tangible threat that the public is seeing, right? At the end of March or the beginning of March, there's no tangible threat because it's just a threat on paper. And yes, I know the freaking Germans, they've sunk the Lusitania and there's 182 people killed, but they're not doing that right now, Wilson. They're not doing it right now, man. Well, that changes. And when does it change? It changes in the middle of March when we start seeing passenger ships getting sunk by the Germans. And suddenly it's not untangible anymore. Now it's a tangible threat. And the American public is quickly changing their opinion because now we have a threat and we're seeing stuff going on around us that we really don't like. So I don't think even a different president at that stage would have actually kept the United States out of the war. I think you would have had to have had. I think you would have had to have had Wilson not be involved at all, ever, never have been president. You would have had a president that was not interested into going into Mexico, and you would have had a president that was not interested in shipping anything to Europe ever, which I'm not entirely sure you would have found, because the way that the war was actually unraveling, I'm not sure was in such a way that you would see such an isolation on the American part, especially considering um, American ties with Canada and Britain and France at the time. I'm not sure. It's a hypothetical, and hypotheticals are always a little bit scary to get involved in, because then you start hearing things just like, well, like I almost started doing, where you're just like, well, Hitler this, okay, what are you trying to say there? Or well, Bush this, or well, Hirohito this, well, Pol Pot this. Well, yeah, we can do that stuff all day, and it's actually a really scary topic to think of, but it's also interesting all at the same time. So, and yeah, it's just as you said. I went on a ramble there, but you actually wrapped it up pretty decently. It's counterfactuals for sure. So, with that, I think we are going to wrap up, at least for now. Um, had fun. The next history stream will actually be next Friday. That will be at 7 o'clock Central Time. We'll be talking with Midnight Lights, Sumi, and Yang, although she's not Yang on Twitch, I know. And we'll be this is going to be a reschedule of the one that we would have had last week, but we had some things come up and we had to reschedule them for next week. So that's going to be next Friday, like I said, at 7 o'clock. And then on the 26th of February, we're going to start a spiritual connection, which is a series I'm super duper stoked to talk about. We're actually going to be talking about the B-2 bomber, its relation to the ATF program, and then operations associated with the sixth generation aircraft FAX. So that's going to be some. I'm going to be talking a little bit over my head for that one, but I think it's going to be really fun. I think it's going to be really interesting. I know Bonnie's going to be interested in that one because planes, vroom. That's not the sound a plane makes. Anyway, but yeah, I'm super duper stoked to have you guys along for the ride on that one. And as always, also super duper stoked that you guys are interested in sticking around. Because I do enjoy doing the history streams. They take a lot of time, but I enjoy doing them. So appreciative as always. So, yeah, Neum. That's the sound that they make. They make the Neum sound. So with that, I am going to wrap up, at least for now. We'll be back later tonight with Jackbox for a little bit more goofy stream after whatever this was that we presented this evening. So with that, folks, Zimmermann Telegram is the one thing that you remember well, so that's good. That's good. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my mods actually remembers history stuff, and it makes me so happy. Anyway, folks, we will see you tonight. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Take it easy.